Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for those of you that had to battle the parking app in the Kane garage. We're working on that, but appreciate everybody being here tonight. My name is Danny Hoffman. I'm the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. Now, let me begin, as we always do at our Jackson School public events, by acknowledging that we are meeting on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and other indigenous peoples across the world. Now again, I want to thank you for being here for this important conversation, Hope and Despair in Israel-Palestine, with Mira Sucharov and Omar Dajani, moderated by Liora Halperin. As most of you know, this is the second event in the Jackson School's War in the Middle East series, and I hope you'll join us again in the coming weeks, including next week's talk on Tuesday, January 30th, by UW Bothell professor Karam Dana, whose talk is titled The Question of Palestine and the Evolution of Solidarity and Resistance in the U.S., and that talk will be at 5 p.m. in the Hub. Now, before I invite College of Arts and Sciences Dean Diane Harris to the podium, I need to do two quick things. The first is to thank the people and organizations that made this evening possible. I'm grateful for the support we received from the Office of the University of Washington President, Omar M, the College of Arts and Sciences through Dean Diane Harris and the Social Sciences Divisional Dean, Andrea Woody, the Jackson School's Middle East Center and Strom Center for Jewish Studies, and our friends and partners at the Jackson Foundation. Special shout out to Monique Thorman and all the staff and students who contributed so much labor to making this evening possible. And of course, thank you to Mira, Omar, and Liora for lending your expertise to this event, and to all of you for taking this occasion to be together for this important conversation. Now, my second job is to let you know that we'll be using slido.com for the Q&A portion of the evening. We'll post the instructions again on how to use this when it's time for the Q&A, but a quick preview, whether you're in person or watching via live stream, if you'd like to ask a question, go to slido.com, slido.com, and type in for the event code hashtag or pound Kanehall, Kanehall. So with that, I would like to invite Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Washington, Diane Harris, to offer some welcome and opening remarks.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I know Danny just made a few remarks of gratitude, but I want to also start by offering my thanks to everyone at the Jackson School for International Studies, the faculty and staff who worked so hard and at really record speed to bring this critically important course on war in the Middle East to our students and this public lecture series into being. This kind of thing, putting together a whole course in a lecture series, usually takes a year or more with lots of planning, and the fact that they did this and they've done it so well and at a moment when we so need it is just amazing, and I can't thank them enough. I want to thank Danny Hoffman for his steady and visionary leadership as director of the Jackson School, Andrea Woody, Divisional Dean of Social Sciences, who has so generously offered her steadfast support to the many faculty whose contributions have made this possible, to our wonderful president, Anamari Kause, and our wonderful provost, Tricia Sirio, who's here with us tonight, for providing financial support that made the live streaming of this event possible. And again, to have this kind of an event reach a wider public at this moment is so important. So thank you so much for that, Provost Sirio and President Kause. And finally, I'm deeply grateful to the faculty who contribute their time and expertise tonight and throughout this series as they endeavor to help us and our students gain a deeper, richer, and more nuanced understanding of this complex and frightening moment in the Middle East. We have an important set of presentations ahead of us, so I'll keep my comments brief. Not too long ago, I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine, a man named William Bro Adams, who is a former president of both Bucknell and Colby Colleges and a former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, about some of the challenges we face today across higher education. There are a few. He said to me, Diane, we have to keep the aperture of purpose and possibility open at universities. We cannot permit that aperture to narrow. I just want to say that again. We have to keep the aperture of purpose and possibility open at universities. We cannot permit it to narrow. I've considered that statement frequently since that conversation. The notion of an aperture of purpose that can open and close, one that can expand almost without limits to permit the free exchange of ideas that we so highly prize at great universities like ours, or that can be narrowed to constrict and even censor, stuck with me. It was one of those concise statements that was said quietly, and yet for me, and I think for our times, it holds so much depth and power. At this moment in our history, the pressures that would aim to force that aperture closed at universities, or at least significantly narrowed, are not trivial. Whether through the banning of books, restrictions on speech, or the elimination of entire theoretical or disciplinary realms from curricula in some parts of these United States, the aperture is closing. When the aperture closes entirely, the world goes dark, and we cannot let that happen. It is our special task, those of us who work in universities, to keep pressing the aperture open, to keep bringing the light that is knowledge, understanding, and the wisdom that comes from learning into the world. Our job every day is to offer our students an education that embraces diverse ideas and perspectives, that provides our students with the ability to make informed evaluations and judgments that are rooted in facts, and that provides them with the ability to discern truth in a world replete with disinformation, to listen respectfully to views that may diverge from their own, and to provide them with the tools to debate, challenge, and to become productive agents of positive change. We do that in exactly the ways we're doing here tonight. Yes, just exactly this, by listening and learning as renowned scholars share deep expertise on the most challenging questions of our time. And we do it through our commitment in the College of Arts and Sciences to the enduring importance of a liberal arts education that prepares our students to be the informed citizens necessary to a flourishing democracy in an increasingly complex world and in which democracy itself appears increasingly fragile. When we gather together in classrooms, in lecture halls like this one, as we're doing here tonight, we participate in an act of refusal of the darkness, and we affirm the breadth of our purpose. Let us not then permit it to narrow. Let's work together, all together, to keep that aperture open. Thank you for being here tonight, and I look forward to learning from tonight's presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Harris. So it's now my pleasure to welcome up to the podium to do introductions for our guest this evening, Dr. Liora Halperin. Dr. Halperin is Professor of International Studies and History and the Distinguished Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies here at the University of Washington. She's the author, most recently, of The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, which is a history of local memory in and around the private Jewish agricultural colonies established in late 19th century Ottoman Palestine. In her first book, Babel Zion, Nationalism and Language Diversity in Palestine, 1920 to 1948, won the 2015 Shapiro Prize from the Association for Israel Studies for Best Book in Israel Studies. Dr. Halperin is a much sought-after speaker internationally and an acclaimed teacher here at home. I'd also add a quick note of congratulations, as Dr. Halperin was just awarded one of 2 inaugural Linda and Stuart Resnick Fellowships at the National Library of Israel, which will support her research in the archives this summer. So Liora, thank you very much for moderating this evening's event.
All right, well, it's great to see so many of you here at the University of Washington. Welcome to Mira and Omar. Welcome to all of you. I'm very pleased to be introducing my colleagues, Omar Dajani and Mira Sucharov, and welcoming them here to the University of Washington. And I want to thank also everyone who's made this event possible. And thank you for your introduction. I first want to introduce our 2 speakers and then offer some framing remarks about this unique conversation. So Mira Sucharov is professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She's the author or editor of 5 books, including, most recently, Borders and Belonging, a memoir, 2021, and Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, Foundational and Contemporary Debates, co-edited with Aaron J. Hahn-Tapper from 2019. She's published over 35 scholarly articles and book chapters, including on the topic of emotion in international relations. She's had op-eds and articles that have appeared in many publications, including the Toronto Star, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, the Forward, and others. Omar M. Dajani is professor of law at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific in Sacramento, California, where he teaches public international law and U.S. constitutional law, among other subjects. He formerly served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, participating in the summits at Camp David and Taba before joining the office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. He has since consulted on a variety of legal infrastructure, development, and conflict resolution projects in the Middle East and elsewhere. His book, Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa, co-edited by Asli Bali, was published by Cambridge University Press earlier this year. So I want to offer some framing remarks and questions before I invite our panelists up to the stage for a conversation. Mira and Omar have spent the past years having deep conversations about their own personal and family histories, beliefs, and identities, and traveling together in Israel-Palestine in the process. And so they're not here solely to talk from positions of expertise, that is, academic expertise, though both have deep and decade-long relevant expertise. So in this sense, it's not a typical panel where two people who maybe don't know each other or don't often work together are invited separately. And I'd like people to think going into this event and be honest with yourselves about what impressions you might be bringing with you to this event from the fact of Omar and Mira appearing together, and maybe also from the bios that I shared. Do you have assumptions or reactions to the fact of a Jew and a Palestinian engaged in dialogue? Perhaps you see it as a model, the only way to peace, even. Perhaps you aspire to something similar or wish that more people could be engaged in such processes. On the other hand, maybe some folks here in the audience see it as problematic, maybe precisely not the right thing to be doing. Perhaps you're suspicious of a Jew who's personally deeply sympathetic to a Palestinian, or to a Palestinian who's devoted such time to understanding a Jewish person, especially in the current context. Maybe even there's cynicism. Does a Jew become acceptable in certain circles only if they have Palestinian friends? Does a Palestinian become kosher to a certain kind of public only when they appear alongside a Jew? You might wonder, what are Mira and Omar's agendas, whether individually or together? What is this really about? There's also the matter of biography. What do you make, going into this event, of the fact that Mira is a diaspora Jew and not an Israeli, or that Omar is a Palestinian American, not a Palestinian living under Israeli rule? Do you wonder why these particular people, among so many possible others, were invited to be part of this series? Do they represent, each of them, a side? Who is the right representative of a side? What stories do you really want to have told? What makes you excited about this event and what makes you wary? And I bring up all of these questions, some of them very probing, because Mira and Omar have been thinking, both individually and together, about all of these questions and more. They understand our discomfort, our many different possible types of discomfort, and they share it. They're trying to model what it looks like to work through it as the two individuals that they are. And so they're inviting us not to trust them or believe in them, but to get ourselves to be as honest as they are about our own assumptions and suspicions and blind spots. Is that possible to do? Is it possible to do after October 7th? Well, let's hear from them and see what they've been working on. So I'd like to invite Omar Dajani and Mira Sucharov to the stage. All right, well, welcome. It's such a pleasure to share the stage with you this evening.
Thank you.
I want to start by acknowledging that for those of us who work on or have connections to Israel-Palestine, or to Israel or to Palestine. There's so much to worry about. And so I want to start by asking, what's keeping you awake at night? But I also want to expand the question beyond fear. What other emotions are you feeling, whether anger, sadness, disgust, shame, even love? And to take a step even further, it was your suggestion that we begin by talking about feelings. And I'm interested in why. Why should we not start by talking about events on the ground, trends or facts, what is really happening, or what has been happening in the past 3 months, right? What are you feeling, and why should we start by talking about feelings? Omar, could you begin?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having us here tonight, and thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. It's a pleasure to be at UW, and a particular pleasure for me because it's given me an opportunity to reconnect with some old friends in Seattle. So thank you on many different fronts. There's a lot of texture to the question that you asked, Liora, and I'll start by answering a narrow part of it. I think that I've felt many of the different things that you described, but one of the things that I would say literally keeps me up at night is guilt. When I have insomnia, which is often, have this meditation app I turn to. And this one meditation that has given me some peace in the past begins by offering reassuring words with the sentence, "You are safe." And that sentence gives me pause because it's impossible for me not to think about folks lying in their beds in the Gaza Strip who are not safe. And it's not abstract. As we'll tell you more about later on, I'm very involved with an Israeli-Palestinian peace movement called A Land for All. And one of my fellow Palestinian board members, there's a joint board comprised of an equal number of Jews and Palestinians. One of my fellow Palestinian board members, his wife, who comes from the Gaza Strip, was awakened by a call at 4 a.m. and told that 8 of her family members had died that night in a rocket strike. I think about a colleague of mine who I participate in a seminar with, a prominent lawyer in Palestine, who luckily has been able to leave, but whose home, painstakingly built over the years, is gone, and he doesn't know what his future holds. And I think about our Arabic teacher, Sarah, who Mira introduced me to, and who we communicated with via Zoom, who is 8 months pregnant and has had to move 5 times over the course of these last few months, and is terrified about what the month ahead portends. And so, thinking about the accident of privilege in my circumstances and the safety that it affords me doesn't provide much help sleeping, nor is it made easier by the fact that safety has become so elusive for so many of us. I was texting over the Christmas break with the dean of my law school, Michael Hunter Schwartz, who grew up in Southern California, an American Jew, who, because I had just spent some time in Israel-Palestine, was constantly writing to me to make sure I was okay. But then mentioned that he and his wife had decided not to put up Hanukkah decorations this year because they didn't want to invite trouble. And the fact that all of us are feeling in these ways, that even those of us who feel deeply for one another are feeling this complicated combination of emotions, makes what's happening across the world enter our lives physically, literally physically, as chemicals wash over our bodies. And so, you know, Mira, at a talk that we were giving on Friday via Zoom at Barnard, said something that I really thought was so wise. When asked how people don't know each other should begin conversations about what's happening, she suggested by asking people to say, asking the question, how are you? And that feels to me, that path toward empathy feels to me like the right way to begin a really hard conversation.
I'm torn between, or I'm toggling between being very distraught over the traumatized societies that are in Israel, Palestine. One where one side, the Israelis and my dear family and friends there who have avoided so far being killed. Actually, not all of them have, because Omar and I did have a friend, Vivian Silver, who is well known in Canada, may be known to some of you, and we had visited with her last summer in her home, and I'd visited her in her home the summer before, and we looked forward to keeping in touch and being in conversation. And on the morning of October 7th, when I realized that her kibbutz Be'eri, was one of the kibbutzim under attack, I texted her, how are you okay? Didn't hear back. We all assumed, we'd heard in the news that she'd been taken hostage. A few weeks later, several weeks later, we all learned that she hadn't been taken hostage at all. Instead, she'd been murdered by Hamas the day of October 7th. I'm also very troubled here by the polarization. And that is the spillover effect of the deeply traumatized societies over there. So I guess polarization isn't as bad as being bombed and killed and being 8 months pregnant like our friend Sarah in Gaza and not knowing how you're going to give birth with no medical care in sight. I guess polarization isn't as bad, but somehow it feels very worrying that we're coming apart when we need to come together to solve the world's problems.
Thank you. So I started up at the podium giving professional bios of both of you, but you're here to talk as much about personal histories as collective or national ones. So I'm hoping you can give us a bit of maybe your other bios, right? The story of who you are beyond your work. Also, how did you meet? And maybe from there, take us into the projects that you've been working on together. Mira, would you like to start?
I'm a Canadian Jew. I was born in Winnipeg. Any Winnipeggers in the audience? Nope. Then I moved to Vancouver, Canada when I was 12. There's probably a couple of Vancouverites here. And I went to Jewish day school and Hebrew summer camp. And I gained a very automatic and visceral and natural and wonderful love for Israel and Hebrew, the Jewish people, Hebrew culture, Israeli food. I went to Israel in 5th grade with my grandmother for 3 weeks, and we went to visit my aunt and uncle who lived on a kibbutz, and I attended school for a few days with the local kids, and I remember one kid saying to the other in Hebrew, "Watch out, she knows Hebrew," and I just took that as such a badge of honor. And I speak only Hebrew to my kids, and I partly decided to do that when they were born. When one was 9 months and the second one was born, from the day he was born, I spoke only Hebrew to them. And I partly did it so that they could get good parts in the summer camp Hebrew plays. And my relationship with Israel's been very rich and wonderful and nurturing, and also very complex. Because as I got older, I wanted to study it more, and I wanted to make a career out of it because I felt so connected. And I wanted a broader view than the one I'd gotten in Jewish day school in the tight-knit Jewish communities of Winnipeg and Vancouver. And so I majored in Middle East studies, and I learned some Arabic and studied some Islamic studies, took a lot of courses on Arab politics, took a course on the Arab-Israeli conflict. We don't call it that anymore. We'll talk more about that later and how we term things and who we leave out and who we include when we use different terms. And, but then a couple of years ago, the aunt and uncle who I'd gone to visit and had these wonderful memories of visiting on their kibbutz and had, when I was young and had been in touch with and very close throughout my whole life. And when I was a teen, they would send me cassettes of Israeli music, Arik Einstein, Shlomo Artzi, and they told me they no longer wanted to be speaking to me anymore. And that was 2 years ago, and that was because of politics. And that was right around the time that I met Omar and decided that I wanted to engage more deeply in dialogue with Palestinians. In fact, I'd met Omar just before they told me they would no longer speak to me. When I told them I was on my way to another research trip and I would stay after Omar and I finished our field work to visit family and friends, and I'd love to see them, and that was the end of that relationship. That's been very painful, and I realized there's been a cost. And there's also been a wonderful gain, which may be because of that, it may not be, and it may just be coincidental. So Omar and I met on Facebook. Apparently, Facebook isn't for the young folks anymore, so we're the old fogies who are still on that platform. And Omar had shared during the last hostilities between Israel and Hamas, the last major round of hostilities before the current war, was in May 2021. And Omar had shared a post about his family's history. When his father was 16, his father and siblings and grandparents escaped the Zionist shelling of their neighborhood, Dajani, in Jaffa, which is the town just amalgamated and just south of Tel Aviv. And they escaped in a fishing boat, and they went north to Lebanon, over to Syria, and then made their way over to Texas, where Omar was born and raised. And when he wanted to give his Facebook followers some sense of what was going on in these hostilities between Israel and Hamas, he wanted his Facebook followers to get a sense of the context, so that 2/3, as we know, of Gaza Palestinians are refugees or descendants of refugees. And I was very touched by the way he was informative and personal and vulnerable, and I did something. I shared it. I shared the post. And then Omar did something that's very not cool. He thanked me for sharing the post. You're not supposed to do that. You're just supposed to rack up the likes and pat yourself on the back and not show that you care. So I thought, here's a nice person. And then Omar asked about my book, and I love anyone who wants to buy my books. And so a couple of months passed after that, and I founded a group for people who feel close to Israeli culture, but also want Palestine solidarity and want to square the circle. And Omar asked me about that group and was interested in finding out more. And so when it was time to write a new book, and I had finished some other projects, I approached Omar and I said, are you interested in exploring some collaborations? And we met on Zoom right around Rosh Hashanah. And I remember it was right around Rosh Hashanah because Omar wished me a Shana Tova, and we began talking.
Omar, could you pick up the story, tell us a bit about yourself, and maybe take us further into what you've been doing together?
Sure, with pleasure, and thank you. As I was, Mira and I had the pleasure this afternoon of spending some time in the class of my friend Smadar Ben Natan. And so if anyone from that class is here, forgive us for repeating some of the stories. But as I was telling those students, one of the deep continuities in my life has been kind of living in between things. My father's Palestinian, as Mira mentioned. My mother was Syrian and French. We're Sunni, Shia, and Roman Catholic. I grew up in East Texas, but went to college in Chicago and law school in New England, and now live in California. And that's just the surface of that in-betweenness. But when in 1999 I moved to Palestine, to Ramallah, to serve as legal advisor to the Palestinian team in the peace talks, as Liora mentioned. My first time there, I found in that place that my name, because I come from a large and old Palestinian family, defined me as Palestinian. And situated me there. And that was an unfamiliar experience in some respects, and a powerful one for me, to feel so at home in a place that I had never been. And an experience that I think is similar to what many other Palestinians and also many Jews feel when they go to this place. And one of the things that I think we'll probably end up talking about is all of the demands that are made on that sliver of land by so many people. But so it was incredibly powerful for me to go and be there. But during that time, what we were very preoccupied with was a peace process that was focused on delivering a particular kind of two-state solution, one premised on separation, one premised on also a kind of historical forgetfulness, on saying, you'll be here, we'll be there, and to the maximal extent possible, and we're going to, because Bill Clinton told us should, forget the things that attach us to the parts of territory that have not been assigned to us. And so, again, we'll talk a bit more about alternative visions a little later, I think, tonight. But one of the things that Mira and I settled on as among our first projects was something that, in a sense, challenged that way of thinking. We decided that we wanted to work on a podcast to reach an audience that doesn't read books, to also, because it seemed fun, and also because I had just finished working on the book that Liora mentioned, and I was tired of writing, not really thinking that, of course, a podcast requires writing too. And after some back and forth, the concept that we settled on, that we've been developing, is called The Vacant Lot. And the podcast will tell the story of a single plot of land, which happens to be the place, a plot in Jaffa, where my family's house once stood. Now vacant, but overlooking the sea in an area that has been very rapidly gentrifying. And so what we have undertaken to do together is not only to look backwards, to tell the story of my family moving from the old city of Jaffa to that part, to Dajani in the 19th century, building it, seeing the way in which this place becomes the economic and political and cultural center of Palestine during the Mandate period, to the drama of it going from that to a ghost town emptied of its population in the space of a few weeks in April and May of 1948. And then the story of those who stayed on, the Palestinians who stayed on, and the Jews who came from Bulgaria and from Iraq and from Morocco and settled in Jaffa, and the lives that they lived. So part of what we are undertaking to do is to look backwards and to tell the story of this complex place in a way that captures its complexity and acknowledges the ways in which it is a microcosm of Israel-Palestine, but also to try to look forward, to think about how Jaffa can once again be home to all of the people who consider it home. And that is a pretty powerful feat of imagination that has only become more difficult since October 7th.
Thank you. So I want to take the conversation now to address, what I imagine many of us are thinking about is the events of October 7th and the military operation on Gaza that Israel has been undertaking in the now more than 3 months since then. So I met you guys as a pair about a year and a half ago when you were in Israel, Palestine, traveling around together and kind of talking with each other and recording your thoughts as you were traveling. As I was preparing for this talk, I realized that if you had been doing that traveling now, the place itself, the people you met, would have likely brought up different thoughts and associations. And so I'm hoping you can address the question of how the events of October 7th and the ensuing bombings and siege and associated Israeli military activity in Gaza has affected your working relationship and also your friendship. Let's see, Mira, you can start.
Maybe I'll start by talking about one thing we did on our last trip last July that we wouldn't have been able to do now. And one of those things we wouldn't be able to do now in the wake of October 7th, and that was visiting my kibbutz family. I mentioned Vivian Silver on Kibbutz Be'eri. Many, many years more than I knew Vivian, I knew and still know very close people, my kibbutz family. Some of you know that some Jewish students like to do a junior year abroad, an exchange type of program, and they get assigned a kibbutz family. And that's what I did on a kibbutz near the Gaza border, known as the Gaza envelope. And that kibbutz family has stayed, and I've stayed in touch with them. They've stayed in touch with me. They visited my family and I in Vancouver and Ottawa and Washington, D.C., and we visited them over the years. And Omar and I visited them last July. They gave Omar their sealed room, the special secure room in the case of, to protect against rocket attacks. And that night, I heard a big crash coming from what sounded like from Omar's room. My room was a couple of doors down the hallway. I decided not to say anything. I didn't want to be naggy. Omar, are you okay? Are you okay? So the next morning, Yonit, my kibbutz mom, texted me. She said a couple things, Mira, in Hebrew. She wrote, don't forget to hang your laundry so that it is time to dry today on the clothesline. And by the way, did you hear the rocket attack last night? It landed probably 300 meters away from the house. So what we had heard that night was a rocket attack, and thankfully all of us were not hurt. Now, during the course of those couple of days that Omar stayed there with us, we ate kosher sushi from nearby Sderot, the town that's in the news a lot, used to be in the news a lot, in October 7th was attacked directly. And we had wonderful conversations with Yonit and Ellie, and even some tough conversations. Omar, after building trust and developing a friendship with them, decided to wade into some key topics about refugees, about return, about what it was like to live near the Gaza Strip, seeing the lights in the background. And we wouldn't be able to visit them today because they are one of the 200,000 Israelis who have been internally displaced. They still live in a hotel put up by, fortunately, they're able to be supported by the government as the other Israelis are. And we don't know if or when they will be able to return to their home. Their son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren were in the process of building a home on that kibbutz as well. We don't know if they will be able to continue that. So that's one small example of something that's changed. And in terms of our friendship, thank goodness we had a rapport before October 7th, because it would have been hard. The weekend of October 7th, we were in New York together because we were about to give a talk at Rutgers, unrelated to October 7th and the ensuing war. This talk had been in the works for many months, and we were going to talk about our research. And that weekend, our wonderful host, Professor Michal Raucher at Rutgers, called us and said, thanks for coming to New York, really happy you're here. But if you want to cancel on Monday, which was to be October 9th, our planned talk, if you need to cancel, totally understand. And we said, no, we do not want to cancel. We need to talk. We need to be in conversation with your students. And Michal helped us reshape our conversation so that it was fitting for the moment. And that's what we've been doing since then. We had established common values. We'd had many conversations. We knew what we both stood for, and we knew a lot about each other as people, not only as political actors, not only as a Palestinian and as a Jew, but as human beings. And our friendship has been tested a couple of times with the events of October 7th. And maybe I'll let Omar tell about the spiciest one.
I will tell you that story, but I want to start off by saying that as difficult as it has been for us to process some things together, it's also been a salve for me, in part because over time I have come to trust and value Mira's take on things so much, and because she kind of pushes back and keeps me honest. And so in part it's about trust, and in part it's about being able to process this incredibly complicated moment with someone. I teach at a law school where I'm the only person who works on these kinds of things. And so to have someone who is a friend and colleague is really great. But yes, sometimes it's not so easy. A case in point occurred this winter. You all undoubtedly have heard about the allegations of sexual violence on October 7th against Israelis and against Israeli women. The reports about those had been made intermittently, but then in late December, the New York Times published a report in which, following a couple of months investigation, a group of reporters laid out their findings about what seemed to have happened. And it was a combination of telling a few particular stories and then reporting more broadly about patterns of violence that the evidence that they encountered seemed to point to. So Mira was in Canada and I was in France with my in-laws, and so in the middle of her night, she sends me a text message saying, "Oh, I was like, why are you up?" She said, "Oh, I'm on Facebook. It's too much for me. Your brother-in-law is engaging in sexual violence denialism." My brother-in-law is not the easiest person in the first place, but had made his way over to Mira's page over this time. So I responded with kind of a cringe emoticon, but then said, "I'm so sorry that he's doing that. I have to say, though, that some of what I read in that New York Times piece didn't seem plausible to me, and I wondered about how much of it was supported by by evidence, excuse me." And then I'll say, and then I'll hand it back to Mira to tell you how she responded and what was going on for her. In my mind, my perhaps reflex in a circumstance like this, which is when a woman alleges rape, your reflex should be to give maximal credibility to her allegation. That was challenged by two other reflexes on my part. One was deep worry about the consequences of some of these claims while Israel was engaged in an assault on the Gaza Strip that was killing thousands of people every week, because any claim of rape will very often be invoked in contexts like this as a justification for the use of violence. But particularly the kinds of allegations that were in that article, I feared were going to set people even more aflame. And then, of course, I was also struggling because it was almost January 1st, and there was a little part of me that was thinking, why is Mira focusing on this? That was October 7th. Thousands of people have died since that occurred. Why is this what we are talking about at this juncture? Mira's response was, and emotionally and otherwise, was different.
So when I first saw Omar's grimace emoji, I knew that he was like trying to be a little sympathetic to me in my distress, but he wasn't really going to deliver. So I was right away primed for him to say, well, I'm not so sure about that article. And when he did, I started text yelling. And I just said, how can you say that? What do you mean anecdotal evidence? Is that what we're calling it now? It's 150 sources that the New York Times has used to draw on. What do you mean? What are we now doubting women's experiences? Are we now doubting accounts? How could you? And I was very, very angry and felt betrayed. And I sort of felt, is this the person that I've come to trust and count on, and this is the person who I feel stands by me, and that we stand together in solidarity working for justice. And I'm standing in solidarity working for Palestinian refugees return all the time and condemning massive Israeli use of force in Gaza. And when you said, why are we still talking about this? And I said, do you not think that I point out injustice wherever it needs pointing? Because I think I do. And then you said.
Well, and we promise this won't go on all evening, but I also realized that what Mira was pointing to was something that is a really real dimension of our challenge, which is that in different moments, in different ways, each of us goes out on a limb for the other one. Not just for the other one. Each of us tries really hard to understand in ways that sometimes alienate us from our own communities. In Mira's case, as you heard earlier, alienated her from parts of her family whom she adores, not people she's indifferent about or finds annoying. Maybe you find them annoying, but whom she cares about. And so what we're mindful of is that these risks that we take for one another and for the other side then leave us feeling really, as she said, betrayed when it's not reciprocated. And so I said as much, and then also, in a maybe patronizing way, said, maybe you should sleep, and we should take a pause, which we did do. And we found our way back to a conversation about this, found our way to a conversation that was rooted in sources and analyzing exactly what evidence had been proffered, also really thinking hard about the reasons each of us was responding in the ways that we were. And we still don't completely agree about this, but it hasn't, I think it's ceased to be the thorn that it was for us.
Thank you. So both of you have been engaged both in a process of understanding yourself, understanding each other, and at the same time understanding a place and its history. And so I want to ask you, starting with Omar, what have you come to understand about Israel-Palestine, or about either Palestine or Israel, that you did not know when you began this work? And what do you think people most need to understand today?
I think that, and this kind of goes back to the point that we started the conversation on about emotion. I have spent a lot of time there. I have a lot of friends who have attachments of all kinds to the place. Mira's not the first Jewish person whom I've had a deep relationship with. But by virtue of our hours and hours of conversation, I think I have a much richer sense of the emotional valence, the emotional pull of the place, and the very different types of pulls that it exerts, of the ways, one of the things Mira and I did together last spring was to visit a bunch of museums that presented Palestinian history from the Palestinian perspective, that presented Jewish and Israeli history from both of those perspectives, and then undertook to compare notes and to compare how each of us experienced it. And it was so powerful. I think the museum that for me was most interesting was the Museum of the Jewish People, both because it was fascinating to me to see the narrative that is constructed in that place, this way the story of the Jewish people is presented and thought about, and the ways in which it is connected to the Zionist project also was interesting for me to see, if difficult. for me to see for a range of reasons. But equally powerful was for me to see Mira's reactions to the place, to see the way that she related to an exhibition of dreidels, things that connected to her cultural experience, her story of peoplehood, and her individual life story. And we've talked a fair bit about the ways in which Israel was for her at a difficult moment in her childhood, kind of a fixed star, something that in a positive sense was an anchor. And so to start to connect these dots, to be able to see the way in the manifold ways in which this place pulls at each of us, and to find in that maybe a recipe for something better there, rather than demands for exclusive sovereignty, feels empowering, and in a very dark period also fortifying.
I think one of the things that I've discovered most about traveling, we've gone 4 times over the last 2 years to Israel-Palestine together, and seeing some of the things that I took for granted through Omar's eyes. Now, I never took for granted the basic, I never didn't see the problems with the occupation. I never didn't see the problems with Jewish, Israeli oppression of Palestinians and discriminatory policies. I knew all that. But there was one thing that really surprised me: how Omar perceives the use of Hebrew in an Israel-Palestine context. So I've mentioned before that I love Hebrew. I speak only Hebrew to my kids. I have a tattoo in Hebrew with my kids' Hebrew names on my arm, which I got after my younger child had their bar mitzvah. And Omar and I would often meet. We did a lot of interviews while we were there and meet with people over coffee, and maybe more formal, less formal, and sometimes they were Palestinian citizens of Israel. And for those of you who know, Palestinian citizens of Israel are perfectly bilingual and often trilingual. So perfectly bilingual between Arabic and Hebrew, and often also know English. My Hebrew is quite excellent, but Palestinian citizens of Israel speak even better Hebrew than me. So sometimes if we were having a 3-way interview in English and they were looking for a word, I might offer it in Hebrew, or I might make a little joke in Hebrew. And I know why I was doing that. I was doing that to create connection. I was doing that to signal, you're one of us, you're one of me, we're all in this land together. I was doing it to bring people together rather than to push them away. That was my intention. After one of these incidents, we were riding a city bus together back to Jaffa across Tel Aviv, and Omar said, "Can I give you some unsolicited advice?" And of course, you're never supposed to say no to that, because that would show my ego is very fragile, which it is. And so when Omar started giving me the advice, I was very happy that I was wearing sunglasses, because I started crying. And it was basically, the advice was, if you're trying to create intimacy and connection with a Palestinian citizen of Israel, Mira, speaking Hebrew to them isn't going to do it. To Palestinian citizens of Israel, Omar said, Hebrew is the language of the colonizer. When you go to the West Bank with me tomorrow, I hope you cover your tattoo. And Omar wasn't the only person who said that. The Palestinian manager of our hotel in West Jerusalem, a wonderful guy named Joseph, who we spent a lot of time talking to, walked by me one day when I had a tank top on, stroked my arm and said, "You better cover that before you go to Ramallah tomorrow." So all of a sudden, I had never anticipated when I got the tattoo that I would have to cover it. I never anticipated that it was anything other than a cultural marker. I didn't sufficiently internalize the politicization of language. I mean, I probably should have. I am a political scientist, I am a social scientist, but perhaps that was maybe a willful blindness on my part, the idea of wanting to believe that my intentions are good and therefore impact should be that way, and it isn't always that way. And the other thing I discovered is the different crisscrossing ideas of privilege. So we talk a lot about white privilege here. We know that Jews versus Palestinians in Israel have a certain level of privilege owing to the state structures that privilege Jewish identities over Palestinian identities to an extent. not totally, because there is a vibrant Palestinian Arabic language school, although there's disparate funding for Arabic language schools versus Hebrew language schools, but there is more of a sense of multiculturalism than a flattening there, so I will want to note that. But when Omar and I went to visit the municipality of Tel Aviv to meet with one of the officials there who works on heritage, and she's quite sympathetic to wanting to elevate Palestinian history and culture, but she is Israeli and she is Jewish. We walked in, and Omar talked about his family and his family name, Dajani, and anybody who works in the Israeli milieu in Israel and knows about Palestinian history knows the Dajani name. These were essentially notables in the early, the pre-Zionist period. And when Omar walked in with me to the room, she hardly looked at me, and she said, "Mr. Dajani," and she almost fainted. I mean, Omar denies this, but he had the blazer, and he cuts a figure as he walks in, and you could see that the pedigree that he has, or had, from his family was ripped away in 1948. I gained privilege. I could immigrate. I thought quite seriously about immigrating. I lived for 3 separate years in the 90s, in my 20s in Israel, and I thought quite seriously about making aliyah, the Hebrew term for immigrating, and I could have done that in a heartbeat. But what I don't have is family pedigree. My name isn't particularly notable. There's not that many of us in the world. We're all kind of related because my great uncle in the war married an Irish nurse, and so there's Sucharovs all over the world. They're not all Jewish, but there's nothing fancy about my name. But I have the kind of privilege in Israel-Palestine today that Omar lacks. And this is something I've noticed more that I hadn't thought about as much.
So I want to ask you one more question before turning to audience questions, which will provide more opportunities to add. And that question is, where does each of you turn today for hope? Omar, why don't you start?
Sure. I'm about to give a plug. For the last year, I've become increasingly involved in the peace movement that I alluded to earlier, A Land for All, it's called. And I really encourage you to Google it and have a look at the website. As I mentioned earlier, worked on the peace process at a time when we were talking about one kind of two-state solution for Israel-Palestine, a kind of two-state solution that has become increasingly difficult to imagine implementing, not least because of the scale of Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank, but also because even in 2000, when relations were immeasurably better than they are now, it was difficult for us to also reach agreement on other issues, like where the borders would be, how Jerusalem might be addressed, sovereignty and control there, what the fate of Palestinian refugees would be, et cetera. And so A Land for All envisages a different kind of two-state solution, one that is premised on the idea that while it is crucial that there be mutual self-determination, that there be a state in which there is a Jewish political majority and a state in which there is a Palestinian political majority. It also recognizes that the entire length and breadth of Israel-Palestine, one place, is cherished by both of the peoples who belong to the land, and accordingly embraces the idea, to be implemented gradually, of course, of freedom of movement and residence across the land of Israel-Palestine for all those who consider it home. And in that respect provides a means of addressing some of the hard issues that divided us in the past. I'm happy to elaborate on any aspect of it, but I just want to say one last thing about it, which is that this movement has been around now for about a decade. This platform is something that was co-created over hundreds of meetings between Jews and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. In September of 2023, it was decided to create a joint board, a Palestinian Israeli board, Palestinian Jewish, I should say, because they are both Israeli, I mean, there is both Jewish and Palestinian Israelis on the board, but we had our first meeting on October 10th. And you can imagine how it could have gone. But what was striking is that meeting was 2 hours of people extending sympathy and solidarity to one another, rather than exchanging vitriol. And I think the reason was not only because folks had built relationships over time, but also because there was a commitment to values underlying this movement, values that both Israelis and Palestinians could embrace with full hearts. And so in these dark moments, and even recognizing how remote the reality that we hope to create is from the one that prevails right now, it's what gives me a lot of hope in this moment.
I'll be brief. I echo that, and I wasn't, when Omar and I first met, okay, so 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I was young, I was a diehard two-stater. Then several years ago, I shifted to one state. Then I met Omar, and he wasn't into one state. He was into this, what he called this modified two-state solution confederation. And I said, what kind of Palestinian are you? And I was sort of doing purity tests on him in our first meeting. And then over the last year, when there was nothing good on Netflix to watch, I would go to YouTube and watch Omar's oeuvre. And one of the things I spent a lot of time watching was Omar explaining Confederation from the heart, sort of like he did just now. And I started listening more and more closely. And I started to be a believer. So 2-state, 1-state, now I'm at Confederation. And since then, I've joined the steering committee of the American Friends of A Land for All. So we're both involved at in different geographic spaces in this. And another thing that gives me hope is the hand-in-hand schools. There's a half a dozen bilingual schools in Israel where half the kids are Palestinian citizens of Israel, a couple of East Jerusalem residents as well, and half the students are Jewish Israelis. And there are 2 teachers at the front of the room, Arabic-speaking teacher and a Hebrew-speaking teacher. They don't do simultaneous translation, UN style. They do a bilingual dance where everybody's involved in a dual language experience all day. Omar and I visited one of the schools in Jaffa. I visited the school in Jerusalem. I burst out crying when I was there, and so then the parents had to start comforting me. It was all about me. It was very embarrassing, but it created a good chapter in my memoir. And so initiatives like this give me hope, where people are coming together and having tough conversations. I mean, on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, that's a stat holiday. But on Yom HaZikaron, the Israeli Memorial Day that precedes Israeli Independence Day, they divide off into Palestinian ceremony of commemoration and a Jewish ceremony of commemoration, and then they come together. So it's not utopia, it's not Pollyanna, it's tough conversations. And the other thing that gives me hope is tonight, and the fact that we have more invitations than we can handle this semester. I mean, we actually have to also teach our own students, even though it's like fun to go to meet other people. And the reason I think we've been getting so many invitations, because there is a thirst for seeing how we're having these conversations. So if there is a thirst for seeing how we're having these conversations, then it makes me think that other people want to have these conversations, and then it makes me think that maybe there isn't as much polarization as there seems, I hope.
All right, well,
until we get to the questions.
Yeah, the questions may cause us to lose hope. I hope that's not the case. So I want to thank you both for your answers to these questions and for bringing us into the space of your conversation. I'm now going to pivot to sharing with you some of the questions from the audience, and a reminder that you can still post via Slido if you want to add your questions. So I'm going to do these questions in clusters to help us get to some bigger issues or other issues that you haven't addressed. So there's a cluster of questions that pertains to a set of terms and slogans or concepts that have been quite contested whether that's in the space of the campus or the space of the media, in our student groups, in our communities. And I'll share with you some of them. So there's one question about the term anti-Semitism being used very frequently. Do you believe the term is being used appropriately and in good faith? There's a question, is Israel an apartheid state? There's another question about chants that come from pro-Palestine students. This particular questioner alluded to students occupying the president's office here at UW and chanting that SPD, that is Seattle Police Department, IDF, Israel Defense Forces, and KKK, they're all the same. We might also add slogans that have been very much discussed in the press: globalize the Intifada, or from the river to the sea. So a lot of terms, and I'm interested, and I don't expect you to address all of these, but maybe each of you can kind of zone in on one or two of these concepts to help us understand how you're thinking about them in this moment.
Maybe I'll start with globalize the Intifada because we have a really another example of a disagreement. This is more of a less painful disagreement, maybe a more productive disagreement. The other one still felt painful, still feels a little painful, the other one that we shared with you. And then I'd like to say something after about settler colonialism. Globalize the Intifada. My daughter's at an Ontario university, she's 19, and she has seen various signs and slogans being chanted, but we're talking visuals. So she sees a sign that says globalize the Intifada. This is back in October, November. She takes a picture of it, sends it to me by text and says, Mom, what do you think? First of all, I'm very happy that finally my kids want to talk about Israel-Palestine, because for the longest time, no, Mom, we don't want to go there. So what do you think? So I said, well, it depends on whether they mean the first Intifada, late 1980s, or the second Intifada, early 2000s. In the first Intifada, it was a Palestinian uprising. Remember, Intifada is an Arabic word which means shaking off, the way a dog might shake off fleas, and the idea was that Palestinians were trying to shake off the occupation. So in the first Intifada, it was mostly stones against tanks, it was slingshots, Molotov cocktails, again, mostly against military targets, strikes, general strikes, civil disobedience. Second Intifada was much more violent, and it involved many more suicide bombings and targeted strikes against Israeli civilians. So I said to her, first, it depends whether it's the first Intifada or the second Intifada. But mostly, I was a little frustrated because I said to myself, I have spent decades telling fellow Jews who are very nervous about Palestine solidarity actions that this isn't about Palestinians hating Jews, that this is about Palestinians trying to push off the structures of oppression in Israel, that Palestinian resistance is meant to be a local idea to push against military targets, and that the Intifada was localized, and all of a sudden they're saying globalize it. So what does that mean? They're going to come to my shul, my synagogue in Ottawa, and bomb me? I'm not occupying them. I'm not an Israeli Defense Forces soldier. I am in Ottawa. What does globalize the Intifada mean? And it really frustrated me. So I shared my frustration with Omar.
And I had a different understanding of the term, unsurprisingly, I suppose, in the sense that when I hear the term globalizing the Intifada, the slogan, what I hear is a desire to confront systems of oppression wherever they may be. I hear a generic call for action toward justice. I hear an attempt to connect different struggles, whether it's Black Lives Matter and Palestinian liberation, or concerns about the IDF and the PD, right? The Washington PD or the LAPD. So to me, it feels like an expression rooted in an attempt at building solidarity, that it's not something that is focused necessarily or even primarily on Jewish people. And I think that that's maybe also the leitmotif that runs through some of the other slogans that you mentioned. The river to the sea one is another piece where I was at a board meeting for my law school not too long ago, and a board member responded to a presentation that I'd given about this book that was alluded to earlier, in which I had been talking about this confederal approach that I was describing earlier. And this board member said, well, you know, how can we even talk about such a scheme when there's so much Palestinian hatred? I mean, I've heard the calls from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free of Jews. And I had to rush to sort of say, first, that's not what's being said, that the of Jews piece may be how you're hearing it. And I understand the reasons why you might be hearing it that way, right? But it's not what's being said. And the second piece was also to sort of say, when people are speaking about their own experience, that they may not necessarily be thinking about you. If Palestinians are talking about their freedom, the point that they're making may not be, again, primarily or even tangentially about what the status of Jews will be in that space in Israel-Palestine. So I think that one of the challenges in relation to these slogans is for us to recognize the gap between the words we use and what we mean for the words we say to suggest, and the way others hear them. To be mindful of that in all circumstances, and to think really carefully about how to allocate the burden of misunderstanding. And my reflex in these circumstances is usually toward more speech, toward more explanation, rather than less.
I'd like to just talk very briefly about settler colonialism. It's become a real lightning rod, the term, because some people use it as a way some people use it simply as a way of an analytical descriptor, because academics love categories, and it's a way to maybe anchor your research and do some historical exploration. But let's leave that aside right now. Many people use it as a way of trying to point to a problem that needs to be solved. Other people who are let's say critics of Israel, let's just say some critics of Israel use the term as a way of pointing to problems that they think need to be solved, as a way of pointing to injustice that they think needs to be made just. Israel supporters hear it as a delegitimization of Israel, and as a delegitimization, let's say, of Jewish identity, and take it as a personal affront. In other words, Israel supporters will say to Israel critics, how dare you call Israel a settler colonial state? Now, the question is Israel a settler colonial state or isn't? We could ask that question, and then, Liora here is an expert on these kinds of analytical categories, and you could give a very informed analysis of that, and we can go there. We can also look at what is the purpose. And if the purpose is to say, I'm hurting, and I'm being oppressed, and I'm feeling for my brothers and sisters in Palestine who don't have electricity and who are being bombed and who have to go through checkpoints, like the manager at the hotel we were staying at, who goes through checkpoints every day with his kids to bring them to a school in East Jerusalem and then to go to his job in West Jerusalem, even though he lives in the West Bank. If that's what it is, and then we simply look at the phrase as saying there are some structures of oppression, there are some levels of privilege that are in place that are leading to these inequalities, and let's see how to fix them. When Dajani did a land acknowledgement at the beginning, did those who aren't Indigenous in this room feel, uh-oh, we're going to be kicked out? Well, no, partly because Indigenous peoples haven't come violently against non-Indigenous peoples, and we have October 7th obviously right now in our memory, and it is very traumatic, so there are real and legitimate fears. But aside from moments of violence, there are ways to right wrongs that enable everyone to be safe and nurtured and secure and live in dignity.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more set of questions, and I want to come back to one of the most sort of productive and also challenging tensions of this work, which is the fact of working across these divides, the personal divides, but also these bigger conceptual divides. So I'm going to bring in two questions here that both address some of those tensions. One of them is a query that maybe multiple people in this room have. Both of you have been using the term Israel-Palestine. What does it mean to use this term, whether with a slash or with a hyphen? What work is the hyphen or the dashes doing? It's like there's a table between you, right? Is that table a slash? Is it a hyphen? Right? How do we think about the relationship between categories? And then the other gets back to something that Mira mentioned, which is about power or privilege. And this is a question about the term war or the term conflict, which implies kind of there are two parties on sort of equal sides of a table. This questioner asks, well, what does it mean to use a term like war? And I would add to use a term like conflict when one side has more power, right? Is this an important piece of the discussion, or is it merely semantic? So these are semantic questions about relationships between concepts.
Conflict is a source of the term conflict has become a source of conflict when studying Israel-Palestine, and a lot of people really don't like the term because they think it implies, a lot of Palestine solidarity folks don't like the term because they think it implies two equal sides. As a political scientist who specializes in IR, that kind of sometimes bugs me because there is a concept in my field called asymmetrical conflict. So just because it's conflict doesn't mean it's two equal sides. But I think I know where they're coming from, and what they want to point to is structures of oppression. In other words, they don't want to think about, we don't talk about, again, indigenous settler conflict right now. We talk about structures. I don't know how much you guys talk about this in the US. In Canada, we're talking about it a lot more, but I'm running with the land acknowledgement, assuming that this is part of your thinking. I hope it is. But so I'm sympathetic to the idea that they want to talk about structures of oppression. We don't talk about black-white conflict. Right? We don't say blacks versus whites. We don't even say race relations anymore for that matter as much, right? We talk about structures of whiteness and how we can chip those away. But in the, what was the other part of the conflict and the
Israel-Palestine.
Oh yeah, but I was going to say, in terms of the term war, again in my field in international relations, we've generally decided that war is, we use the term war after a conflict reaches 1,000 battle deaths. And sadly that happened within a few hours on October 7th. So I guess according to the wonky academics, we're allowed to call it, at the Correlates of War Project at University of Michigan, we can call it a war. But again, Palestinians want us to think about the ongoing structures of oppression and the history of Zionist settlement and colonization or colonial moving in and establishing communities that then ended up displacing Palestinians, sometimes by force. Israel-Palestine, we're both writers and we argue a lot about style, although I usually defer to Omar because he's pretty much always right, but we do differ on hyphen and slash. Partly because I already have a book, an edited volume that has a slash, so I feel like I have to be loyal to my other work, and what do you do when you start collaborating with new research partners and new editors? I think, honestly, I haven't told you this, but sometimes I prefer just to say Israel, or if I'm writing a text to you, I just want to say Israel, but I don't because I'm worried you'll be mad.
I would be. I'd like to talk about two things. One is Israel-Palestine, and then one is this broader question of power in this context. So I was working on a grant proposal over the summer with a team of scholars in London, and we ended up using Palestine-Israel as the frame, which I actually opposed. I was advocating Israel-Palestine. It was my Israeli colleague who insisted on Palestine-Israel, ironically. But I will confess that the reason I wanted it to be Israel-Palestine, and I'm less invested in dash versus slash, although I like dash because I like to think of it truly as both, as opposed to, for some it's this and for others it's that. But the reason why I was attached to Israel-Palestine was because I wanted to normalize its use. To me, it seemed important for people to stop referring to it just as Israel, to stop erasing Palestinian connection to that place, And it seemed to me likelier that folks who are thinking about Israel are going to come to Israel, Palestine, than are likely to come to Palestine, Israel. See, my scheme is now revealed to you. We'll see if it works. But I will say, though, that this point connects to the reason why this movement, A Land for All, that I described earlier, resonates so much for me. I feel very powerfully that every decision we make about that place should be informed by the recognition that it is cherished by both of these peoples and that neither is going anywhere, period. That neither is going anywhere. So every single thing that we do needs to bear in mind that forever we're going to be neighbors in that land, close neighbors, because it's small. And so when you start thinking through that lens, I think a range of things start to look different. And so that's another reason for me that calling it Israel-Palestine feels crucial. A last thing, though, calling it Israel-Palestine shouldn't erase the radical asymmetry between the two peoples who live there. And here, I think that this is something that's probably known to most people in this audience, but that I think is not known to most people in this country, for example. And this is why terms like conflict loom so large, and even indeed why apartheid is a term that so many Palestinians really insist that the world engage with, along with human rights organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, Israel's premier organization. It's a place where there are, at this point, about the same number of Jews and Arabs, 7 million of each. Around a little less than 2 million of those Palestinian Arabs have political rights in Israel. But 5 million are deprived of political rights. They're deprived of the opportunity to choose the government that makes all of the important decisions about their lives, and they have been so deprived for more than a half century. Netanyahu would not be the leader of that space if all the people in that space who were adults could vote. He wouldn't be. And we can't forget that fact when we talk about the reality and when we talk about the future. And so for me, it's bringing these two ideas together, that we are forever going to be together in that space, and that what prevails there is profound inequality that needs to guide our approach to thinking about and responding to what happens day to day.
Thank you so much to both of you. There are many more questions that we didn't have time to get to, but you've just opened a conversation for us. And I know I speak for all of us in thanking you for your honesty, for your vulnerability, thanking you for giving us a window into your ongoing conversation, and I hope making each of us ask, what conversations do we want to open and with whom? So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.